The main thing is if you have a selection always looks like what is affectionately known as marching ants, an edge that is moving on your screen. And anytime that is active, it means whatever you do is only going to be able to affect that part. If it's painting, a filter, or an adjustment that you create from that point until the selection is no longer there. If you take that selection, you can then store it somewhere. The place you store it is the Channels panel. Or you can attach it to something. And when you do, it's known as a layer mask. Remember, the layer mask is an icon at the bottom of your layers panel. Looks like a circle sitting inside of a rectangle. In fact, it looks a lot like the layer mask that's attached to this particular layer right now. It's the layer mask. So we're going to be working with selections and masks, and we're going to be mixing in adjustments with them because we haven't really done that much with adjustment layers. In Photoshop, there are two ways of applying an adjustment. The first is what you might call a direct adjustment. A direct adjustment would be, let's say I selected this area on this particular image. In my layers panel, if you look at what's active right now, you notice it's not the mask because the corners of the mask are not highlighted. Instead, it's the image itself. So that any change I make is going to happen there. If I were to go over here and do some sort of an adjustment, let's just say brightness and contrast. The selection that's there is going to limit what area can be changed. So it's only the area that's inside those marching ants. And I could come in here and brighten or darken that, or I could make it more contrasty or less. But it's the selection that is preventing it from affecting the entire picture. If the selection wasn't there, it would affect all of whatever is active right now in my layers panel. If I had 10 layers in this document, only that one would change. Because when you do what I call a direct adjustment, and a direct adjustment is when you come up here and choose it from this menu, it affects only one layer. That's the layer that's currently active. And when you're done, it's permanent. There's no thing that I could turn off to make it go away or anything like that. If I save and close my image, open it 6 months later, there's no evidence that I've made that adjustment other than what the end result looked like, but there's no thing that says you applied brightness and contrast and you can turn it off here. You can't do that part. Instead, I can create an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer is something where the adjustment becomes a separate piece of this document. It will become a layer. Think of it as if you have an image underneath you. You're standing up, you're looking down, and on the floor there's a picture. In between you and that picture is something that is changing your view of the picture. There's a pair of sunglasses sitting there, floating in the air between you and the image. It's darkening the picture. That's the one-to-one adjustment layer. It's something that is changing your view as you look through it. So let's do an adjustment layer. So I've selected this area because that's the part I want to change. Now, instead of coming up here to apply an adjustment, those would be direct adjustments, and I try to avoid them if at all possible because there are things that are this is more permanent. Instead of doing that, I go to the bottom of my layers panel. And at the bottom of my layers panel is a half black and half white circle. If I click on it, it also has a list of adjustments. They are some of the same adjustments that you find under the Image Adjustments menu, the menu I showed you a moment ago. Not all of them, but there's a good number of them sitting right here. These are the ones that are available as an adjustment layer, and there you'll find the choice, in this case, of brightness and contrast. I'm going to choose it. Now watch what happens in the Layers panel when I do that. First, remember I had a selection active. Do you see that the selection, if you look at the picture itself, seemed to have gone away? Because I don't see little marching ants around that object anymore within the picture. A minute ago, we had marching ants around this object. They're no longer there. That's because that selection got converted into this thing. I can see the shape of where the marching ants used to be right there. They got converted into that. That's a layer mask. How do layer masks work? Remember, black hides things, white makes them show up. In this case, what's in this layer is an adjustment. It's called brightness and contrast. And the white that's in here means it can only apply to that part of my picture. It can't apply to everything else. That's what the mask is doing. So when I end up making my change, if you look at the picture, we're still only affecting that one area. But it's the mask that's doing the limiting instead of the selection. The selection got converted into the mask. It's now attached to that adjustment. And so now it's as if we're standing at the top of the layers panel, we're looking down, and before our eyes can pick up what's in the bottom layer, which is the picture itself, it has to look through this adjustment to see it. And it's changing our view of it, like a pair of sunglasses might be sitting there darkening our image. Now we can have as many of those adjustment layers as we'd like. And if I don't have a selection ahead of time, then this is what we get. I'll do another brightness and contrast, and I'm going to darken the image. And notice that the entire image is darkening because there's nothing limiting where it happens. If you look at the mask, there's automatically a mask attached to adjustment layers. It comes automatically right there. And when I'm done making the adjustment, the mask is sitting there, and if you look at the mask, it's active. You see the corners are highlighted? That means if I paint, that's where the paint goes. So now I could grab my paintbrush tool, and if I paint with black, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be hiding the adjustment. Because what am I working on? A mask that's attached to that adjustment. So if I paint right now, the image will become brighter where I paint. What it's doing is it's going back to what it used to look like in the areas where I paint. And I can come in here and just kind of paint around and get rid of it wherever it is I didn't want it. And if I zoom up here. So you can either make a selection before you create your adjustment layer, or afterwards, if you need to limit where it's going to apply, just grab your paintbrush tool and start painting. You won't always see a dramatic change in your image when you paint. All you're seeing is you're removing whatever adjustment is in that layer. If the adjustment that's in that layer is overly subtle, where it's doing something that is barely perceivable, then when I paint like this, it will be really hard to tell where I've painted because whatever's in that adjustment layer isn't doing much to my picture. So when I paint and it disappears and no longer applies to my picture, it's really hard to tell where I've done that, where I haven't. It was just a very subtle change. In this case, it's a relatively obvious change because I'm darkening and it's easy to tell. If it was a subtle change, I don't know if you remember or not, but earlier today I had a mask attached to something. And there was a way where I could view that mask in a different way. I could view it as a red overlay on top of my picture. Hit the letter X here to switch what color I'm painting with. But I could view it as an overlay. And the key that I pressed on my keyboard to do that was to hit the backslash key. And so I can do that right now. Anytime you have a layer that has a mask attached to it, if you hit backslash, you get a red overlay. It looks like quick mask mode. Quick mask mode just means something overlaid on your picture as a red overlay to some people. But in quick mask mode, it's just not attached to a layer. In this case, it's attached to a layer. It's the same technology as quick mask mode, but it's not called that. It's just overlaying the mask on your picture. So to get this view, when you're working with a layer mask, you press backslash. To get this view instead, when you're working with a selection where it looks like marching ants, you type Q for quick mask. So quick mask and this are the same concept. It's just in one case you have a selection, and in the other case you have a layer mask. Two slightly different things that you're working on, but we can get a view that looks the same. I'm pressing the letter X to exchange more foreground and background colors whenever I'm switching what I'm painting with white versus black to try to kind of isolate this. So if you see me just magically somehow removing the red versus adding, I'm hitting X to switch back and forth between black and white. So then when I think I'm done and I've isolated that nicely, I can press the backslash key again to turn off the red overlay. And if you want to see what I'm doing, I will turn off the eyeball for that layer. Now when I turn off the eyeball, it's going to no longer apply that adjustment. So you'll see what it looks like without the adjustment. Turn it back on, you'll see what it looks like with it. And I can do the same thing for the one that's underneath. Okay. So what did we learn there? Well, if you have a selection active at the time that you create an adjustment layer, the selection gets converted into the mask, where the only part of the image that changes is the part that was selected. And that's what I did a minute ago. I'll do it again right now. Let's say I came in here and I made a selection. In this case, I'll use the elliptical marquee tool, and I'll select the little eye that's here. Close enough. And then I'm going to create an adjustment layer. So I go to the bottom of my layers panel, click on the half black and half white circle, and again I'll choose brightness and contrast. That selection, the moment I let go to create this adjustment, will go away and is being transformed into the mask that's attached to the layer. Can you see a little white speck right there? That's where it is. Got converted into that, so it's attached to this layer. And now maybe I brighten up that eye, add a little contrast to it. Then I want to add to that mask. So I grab my paintbrush tool, and black is going to prevent whatever's in this layer from affecting the image, but white will make it show up. So I'll paint with white, and I'll come in here, and I'm going to paint on this other little circle over here to say apply to this too. I'll get a smaller brush, and I'll paint there. Okay. And we got some other ones up here on the tail. Do that as well. As many areas as I want, I can have apply to that. So now if I hit backslash key again, I can see a red overlay to say where is that adjustment applying. It's wherever you don't see red. That's where the adjustment is applying. So these are adjustment layers. And whenever you add a new one, always put it on top, because the order is important. The top one will look at what's underneath to see what is it adjusting. And so if I add another one on top, it's looking at the result of what we already have. That's what it's adjusting. If I were to put one way down below, it looks down and sees the original picture, and that's what it applies to, and that modifies what the adjustments above it are seeing or applying to, and it can sometimes create unpredictable results if you don't really think through it. And most of the time it's too hard to think through how would that affect all this stuff that's above it. So you create new adjustments on top. And if you do that, it always works in a logical and straightforward way. And you can have as many adjustment layers as you'd like. You can have 50 of them, 500 of them, whatever you want. Just stack them up, put new ones on top. And then if you ever want to see what's happening to your image, how they're affecting your image, you can turn off the eyeballs on each one, on and off. You can see what that one's doing. You can go down to the next one, turn off its eyeball, see what it's doing. The next one, on and off, and so on. That's actually the pictures. That's why it disappeared. And there's a trick. If you want to see the before and the after when it comes to adjustment layers, usually the bottommost layer will be your original picture. And there's a way to turn off all of the eyeball icons in your layers panel except for one. What you do is you put your mouse on top of the one eyeball you want to stay on. You want to keep that one on. You hold down the Option key, which is Alt in Windows, and you click on it. And by doing so, it says turn off everything but this. And therefore, I'll see the original picture. When you're done with that, you Option click on it a second time. And it turns back on those eyeballs that were on previously. And it will remember which ones were on or off previously. So it brings you back to the same state you had beforehand. And therefore, it's a nice kind of before and after when it comes to your adjustments. If the bottommost layer is your original picture, and you've built up a stack of adjustments above that. Then remember, with each adjustment, you can click on it, hit the backslash key. Whatever's covered in red is where you're not affecting the image. Then you can go to the next one, backslash key, and see exactly where they're applying. So if you open an image that is 6 months old and you forget what's really in that, and you see these little masks, you can click on each one of them, hit backslash to see what part of the image does it affect. And if no red shows up on top of your image, it means your mask is completely full of white. And that means that that adjustment affects everything. The whole image is affected by it. And so you can build this up, do whatever kind of effect you like. And so I use adjustment layers all the time to refine my images. And it's what I would prefer to do instead of going to this menu to apply my adjustments. Because this menu applies the adjustment directly to whatever layer is currently active and does it in a way that's permanent, where if I save and close my image, it's not a separate piece of the image. The adjustment isn't. It's just the end result of what the adjustment did in a way that I can no longer undo, I can no longer change if I save and close that image. So I try to stay away from this menu right here. And I try to, as much as I can, instead go to the menu at the bottom of my Layers panel and choose from here. Because those are ones I can throw away later on if I decide it wasn't a good adjustment. I can modify the mask later. I can even change the adjustments. If you go to any one of these adjustment layers, and you see the icon on the left, that icon will be different depending on what kind of adjustment you apply. So if you apply an adjustment called levels, this will look more like a bar chart, like the histogram. If you apply one called curves, it'll look like a curve, and so on. This happens to mean brightness and contrast. And if you ever open an old document and you see that icon over there, something like it, if you double click on that icon, it will open up the little panel where the adjustment was, and you can modify it. It's never permanent. Go to the next one, and it just changes this to whatever that adjustment was. This little panel that's called Properties simply shows you the settings for whatever adjustment layer is currently active. It's only if this is hidden that you have to double click on that icon just to get it to pop up. So if I close it like that, that would get it. So just build up your adjustments. Do all sorts of things with them. It can be really nice. And so we'll do that throughout time. For now, I'm just going to save this image. And I'll close it. Now, another thing I wanted to mention that I didn't get a chance to when this was open, because I just didn't think of it, was during the break some people asked, with an image like this, how simple it was, is couldn't I use a simple tool to select that? Like there's a tool called the Quick Selection tool, there's another tool called the Magic Wand tool, and all that. And you could try to use tools like that to select something simple, but if the edges, if it had soft edges, like I've blurred the right side of this, those tools would suddenly fail you. Or if the edge of this was overly complex, like if I apply a filter to it that is called Ripple, and I get the edges where if you zoomed up real close, it's overly complex, especially where there's like little openings in the middle, like those tiny ones in there and stuff. Using normal selection tools, not going to usually give you necessarily a great result with that. So I happen to have something that was simple here when I started this off. And in that case, Magic Wands and quick selection tools and things might have given you somewhat of an acceptable selection, but they wouldn't in this case, especially where you have soft edges and stuff over on this side. Whereas the technique that I showed you, where we copy this, we paste it into quick mask mode in things, would give you a perfect selection of it each time. So I just wanted to mention that in case that went through your head when I was working on this. I've really uglified it from what my wife made.